here today to talk about his new book, That Used to Be Us, How America Fell Behind in the World We Invented and How We Can Come Back, Mr. Thomas Friedman.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Luke. It's a treat. I guess we got 15 minutes here, so I'm not going to try to do the whole That Used to Be Us. I will just say that whenever Michael and I, my co-author Michael Mandelbaum of Johns Hopkins, whenever we tell people about the book, you know, That Used to Be Us, their first question always is, does it have a happy ending? And we tell everybody it does. We just don't know yet whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And that's really our job. So for those of you who haven't read the book, really the guts of it is about education, because we really believe that education is the key to economic growth in a knowledge economy, and economic growth is the key basically to national security. So we have 4 education chapters in the book, and I'm going to just really quickly survey those because they're the ones most germane to our discussion here tonight. At some point, could somebody get a glass of water, though, for us up here? It'd be really great if somebody could get a bottle or a glass of water. Thanks. So the first chapter, Michael and I are both movie buffs, and the first chapter is called Up in the Air, from the great George Clooney movie, which we consider to be the movie of our time. It is actually it's a brilliant movie of our time. For those of you who haven't seen it, George Clooney plays a character whose job is to go around the world firing people on behalf of multinationals face to face. And he's replaced when his assistant invents a cheaper way to do it over the internet. And I'll explain to you why that is the movie of our time, because I'm a big believer that in writing about the world, I always like to start with what I call the kind of technological economic plumbing, because when you know where that's at, it can tell you a lot about what is possible. And so we do that in this book. Now, as Luke said, I wrote a book in 2005. It came out, actually started it in 2004, called The World is Flat. It was about the connecting of the world at a whole new difference of degree that's a difference in kind. The basic argument of this book is that we've gone from Flat World 1.0 to Flat World 2.0. We've gone from a connected world to a hyper-connected world. And actually, that is the most important thing that's happening in the world today. We're not talking about it at all, but that is actually, if there were no subprime crisis, if there were no post 9/11, that's all we would be talking about. We're actually going through another huge tech revolution. And the way I express this in the book is by pointing out that when we sat down to write this book, I went and got the first edition of The World is Flat off my bookshelf, which I said I started in 2004. I cracked it open, I looked in the index under F, FFFA. Facebook wasn't in it. So when I was out saying the world is flat, Facebook didn't exist, Twitter was still a sound, the cloud was still in the sky, 4G was a parking place, LinkedIn was a prison, applications were what you sent to college, and for most people, Skype was a typo. Okay? All of that happened after I declared the world was flat. So think about that. And it all happened in 6 years. So we've actually gone from a connected world to a hyper-connected world. And it's changing everything. So that's the underlying plumbing of what's going on. The next chapter on education, because we thought, well, before we actually talk about education, it might be helpful actually to talk to employers and ask them, what are they looking for in employees in a hyper-connected world? And we interviewed 4 generic employers, a high-end white-collar firm, the head of a national law firm based in Washington, D.C., their Washington office head, a low-end white-collar, the outsourcing firm 24/7, where I actually started The World is Flat in India, a huge blue-collar firm, DuPont, and the world's biggest green-collar firm, the U.S. Armed Forces. And what is striking, thank you, Mark, is that when you talk to these 4 generic employers, what's so interesting is that they're all looking for the same employee. But before I tell you what is that employee, let me tell you what's basically happened to the labor market which is driving them all to this employ. Now, we all know traditional labor markets divided up into three broad segments. The top was always called non-routine work. Non-routine work is the work of mathematicians and scientists and writers and artists and hopefully journalists and teachers and engineers, work that cannot be described by an algorithm and therefore cannot be outsourced, automated, and digitized. We all want to be non-routine workers. Then there was routine work, and routine work has been absolutely crushed. It's been automated, it's been outsourced, it's been digitized. There's nothing there anymore. And at the other end, I don't say the bottom end because these wages will depend very much on the health of your local community, is called non-routine local work, work that has to be done face to face. That's the work of the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the nurse, the dentist, the doctor. But their wages will be determined basically by the overall health of the economy, which is set by the non-routine high-end workers. So that's basically been what the labor market looked like. Now, what has happened as we've moved from a connected world to a hyper-connected world is that it's not enough anymore to just be non-routine. I'm non-routine. I'm a journalist. No, you now have to be creative non-routine. And it's not enough to be local non-routine. You have to be creative local non-routine. We call it in the book creative creators and creative servers, basically. And so it's not enough to say I'm a lawyer. You got to be a creative lawyer now. It's not enough to say I'm a scientist. You got to be a creative scientist. Not enough to say I'm an accountant. You have to be a creative accountant. Not a creative accountant, but you know what I mean. Okay, we have enough of those, but you know what I'm saying. Now, the way we discovered this was by actually talking to those 4 employers, Help Wanted. And as I said, what you discover when you actually talk to employers today is they're all looking for the same employee. Employees who can do critical reasoning and problem solving, ... in order to get an interview. Yeah, critical reasoning and problem solving, that's now table stakes. What employers are actually looking for today are people who can not only do their job in a non-routine way, but invent and reinvent their job as they're doing it. Okay, that's actually what people are looking for. Why? Because as you go from connected to hyper-connected, the world becomes so fast and change starts to happen so quickly, okay, that the big boss up here cannot have a clue what's going on down here unless he or she has people on the line touching the product and the customer who can not only do the job but invent, reinvent, and see where the openings are for the next product. You're really finished. And so that's actually what everyone's looking for in different ways. So for instance, we interviewed this high-end white-collar law firm. Jeff Lesk is the managing partner of the Washington office of Nixon Peabody. And the first thing he says in the interview is, we just hired a chief innovation officer. And how many law firms have you ever heard of having a chief innovation officer? But that's because their product cycle is just turning over that quickly. They felt they needed to actually create a chief innovation officer. But what's most revealing about the interview with Jeff, as you see in the book, this all started, he happens to be a family friend. In the 2008 subprime crisis, we asked Jeff, we were out to dinner, he and his wife and I, his wife's from Iowa, where my wife's from. And I asked Jeff, subprime crisis, what's happened to the law firm? He said, oh, business way off, way off. I said, what are you doing? He said, we're laying people off. I said, that's interesting. In a law firm, who gets laid off first? Is it last in, first out? He said, not anymore. The people being laid off are those who were in the bubble when we had a pile of work and we handed them that work and they did it in a routine, non-routine way and handed it back. They're gone. The ones who are staying are those who came to us and said, Jeff, we could do that old work in a new way. Or we could do new work in a new way. They were doing non-routine work. They were creative, non-routine. Now, the most revealing interview of these 4, I think, is with the head of that green-collar firm, the U.S. Armed Forces. By dumb luck, his name is General Martin Dempsey, and we happened to interview him. You've seen his name in the paper because he just became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but we interviewed him because he was at the time head of the U.S. Army Education Corps. But what makes General Dempsey so interesting is that he's actually most famous for the fact that he commanded the 1st Armored Division that took Baghdad from Saddam Hussein in 2003. He is the man who took Baghdad. In 2008, he became he became head of CENTCOM, our Middle East headquarters. And he tells this story in the book. As head of CENTCOM, he was out in Afghanistan, far-flung base out in the Hindu Kush, commanded by a U.S. Army captain. He sat down with that captain for 2 hours, and when he got done, he realized that that captain at that far-flung base in Afghanistan had access to more intelligence at the tactical and national level and could order up more firepower from that base in far-flung Afghanistan than he, General Dempsey, could when he took Baghdad from Saddam Hussein in 2003. That's how much things had changed. So he came back and he completely revamped the U.S. Army education system, beginning with giving new recruits an iPod or an iPhone as soon as they show up at boot camp. And within 3 weeks, you may be asked to download the lesson. You teach the course while the drill instructor sits in the front row. So he's completely revolutionized because he realized if that officer has access to that much intelligence, that much firepower, we have to select and train that officer, he or she, totally differently than we've done in the past. So that's basically what's happening in the labor market. That leads then to the next chapter, which is about our education challenge and in the country. And the chapter is called Homework Times 2 equals the American Dream. Because you're now going to have to do homework times 2, we all are, in order to pass on that American dream to the next generation. And it begins actually with a long riff about how we are not educators, and Hillary Clinton never would have asked us for advice. But if she ever did, we would have told her, you don't want to be Secretary of State. It's a loser job in this era. You want to be Secretary of Education. It's the national security job. Our education challenge today is therefore twofold, given this Help Wanted chapter. We need to do two things at once. We need to lift our bottom to our average so much faster. As you all know, we have so many people in our biggest urban centers who are just way below average. And in a world where those middle jobs have been crushed, there is nothing for them. There's absolutely nothing for them down there. If you do not have a high school degree that allows you to get through college without significant remediation, there is literally nothing for you. I always tell the story when I wrote The World is Flat. You know, the biggest employer in Baltimore 50 years ago was Bethlehem Steel. The biggest employer today in Baltimore is Johns Hopkins University Medical Center. That's the whole shift in a nutshell. In 50 years ago, you could drop out of high school, join the union, get a job at Bethlehem Steel, get a mortgage, buy a house, have a yard, a dog, and 2 kids, retire, and live your middle-class American dream. Today, they do not let you cut the grass at Johns Hopkins University Medical Center without a BA. Okay, so there is nothing for you down there. So we have to bring the bottom to the average so much faster, and we have to bring our average to the global average so much faster. One is a more education problem, the other is a better education problem. The first requires more R's, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and the second requires the 3 C's, communication, collaboration, and creativity. So we actually have a dual education challenge right now, which makes the challenge that much bigger. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, very easy for you to say, Mr. New York Times columnist. Let me tell you about my job. I inherited James Reston. I became the foreign affairs columnist of the New York Times in January 1995. I inherited James Reston's office at the New York Times Washington Bureau. What a thrill, this great editor and columnist of the Times in the 60s and 70s. Now I suspect Mr. Reston used to come to his office in the 60s and 70s and say to himself, I wonder what my 7 competitors are going to write today. And by the way, he knew all 7. Walter Lippmann, Stuart Alsop, Mary McGraw, he knew all 7. I do the same thing. I come to the office every day and I say, I wonder what my 70 million competitors are going to write today. Same thing, same problem, you know. I was just in India. Some of you may have seen I did a column Sunday about $35 tablet being invented in India by a IIT in Rajasthan. And I was really struck in the comments. If you go to New York Times Online, click on comments, there was a comment there from an Indian firm that had tested the product and ran all the specs of their tests. And thankfully, you know, affirmed what I was saying. But that's how quick this is now. That's how on your toes I have to be when I'm writing about these countries. There's no high. When I was in Beirut in 1982, the New York Times, it took 6 weeks to get there. Okay, I could write anything about Yasser Arafat. And maybe some Palestinian in New York would pick up the phone and say, "Did you see what Friedman wrote about you? Who? Friedman, did you? I can't hear you." Yeah. Now, in seconds, they're commenting on your column, whatever it is, about any part of the world, by the people who live there. Okay, so I'm working harder than ever, and that leads to the last chapter, and I'll stop after this, which is called Average is Over. Average is officially over. You see, what's happened basically in a hyper-connected world is it's as if we were all in the same math class, and the curve just got lifted. Because basically, in a hyper-connected world, every boss now has access to more automation, software, cheap labor, and cheap genius than ever before. So if you can't give that extra, if you can't justify some unique value contribution you're making, if you don't find your extra, you're going to have a real problem, because average is officially over. And that's really the challenge again for education. Because extra is not something you can teach. Extra can only be inspired. So it requires a particular kind of teaching that can inspire people to bring the extra out of them. In conclusion, 3 pieces of advice I give to friends and parents and to myself. How do you then approach this world as an educator and as a parent? You want your young people, you want your kids, I think, to think about the world in 3 ways. 1, think like an immigrant. 2, think like an artisan. And 3, think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House in Minneapolis, my hometown. So let me explain. First, think like an immigrant. How does the immigrant think? The immigrant thinks, you know what, I just arrived in Washington, D.C., and there is no legacy spot at Georgetown University waiting for me. Okay. So I better figure out what world I'm in here, where are the opportunities, and I better pursue them with more vigor and vitality and energy and stick-to-itiveness than anybody else. There's no legacy spot waiting for me. We are all new immigrants to the hyper-connected world. Think like an immigrant, be hungry. Second, think like an artisan. This is an idea from Larry Katz at Harvard. Who is the artisan? The artisan was that person in the Middle Ages, before mass manufacturing in factories, who made every item one-off. Every pair of shoes, every utensil, every piece of furniture, every piece of clothing, every saddle was made individually. And the best artisans did what? We know they carved their initials into their work. Do your job every day with that something extra, so you would be prepared and want to carve your initials into it at the end of the day. Think like an immigrant, be hungry. Think like an artisan, take pride in your unique value contribution. Lastly, think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House. I'm from Minneapolis. My favorite restaurant back home is Perkins Pancake House on Highway 100 and 494. I was there on a Sunday morning while writing the book with my best friend, Ken Greer. 7 a.m., we ordered breakfast. I ordered 3 buttermilk pancakes and scrambled eggs. Ken ordered 3 buttermilk pancakes and fruit. After 15 minutes, the waitress came, put our 2 plates down, and all she said was, to Ken, I gave you extra fruit. She got a 50% tip, okay? Because that waitress didn't control much, but she controlled the fruit ladle. And that was her extra, okay? What was she doing? She was actually thinking entrepreneurially. In her little world, she was thinking like an entrepreneur. Think like a new immigrant, be hungry. Think like an artisan, take pride in your unique value contribution, your extra. And lastly, think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House, be entrepreneurial in whatever you do, because average is officially over. Thank you.